in the capital.
Tokyo increasingly is saying, we will show central authority by first replacing daimyo with governors, and then replacing those governors with men from other parts of Japan to show that it's Tokyo's authority that holds sway even in the countryside.
The final humiliation came with a law completely banning the wearing of swords, the most visible symbol of the samurai. By 1877, samurai in Japan's conservative southwest province of Satsuma had had enough. 9,000 warriors rose in rebellion, led by a talented war chief named Saigo Takamori. Ironically, Saigo had helped overthrow the shogun 10 years earlier. The rebels carried a mixture of modern rifles and traditional weapons, but the arms weren't sufficient to stand up to the hordes of government troops sent to crush the uprising. After weeks of fighting and an ill-fated siege of a government stronghold, the surviving rebels fell back to Satsuma for a last stand near Saigo's home in Kagoshima. On the cool morning of September 24th, Saigo and 300 of his die-hard followers marched out, armed only with swords, to meet the enemy.
They want the symbolism of the swords. They're also out of gunpowder. And they've spent the evening before writing poems about it. They've spent the evening before celebrating their deaths. And it's all but choreographed. They march out into a hail of gunfire. They're surrounded by cannon. They're surrounded by tens of thousands of Japanese imperial troops. And they fully know they're going to die.
The majority of the rebel samurai met their deaths within minutes. Saigo himself was wounded by gunfire, and a few faithful servants carried him to a nearby hillside, where they helped him end his life in the traditional samurai manner.
He didn't actually commit seppuku because he was shot through the hip and fell. He was probably unable to sit. He may have gone into shock immediately. He was certainly unable to sit up and pull a sword and slit his abdomen. But his men took his head anyway, and they hit it. They hit it as though this were 1220. You would not want the enemy army to get that head and have a trophy.
The crushing of the Satsuma Rebellion marked the end of violent resistance to the modernizing reforms of the Meiji government.
After 1877, no one thinks that force of arms are going to preserve the samurai way of life anymore, and everyone recognizes that you basically have to take this new Meiji state on its own terms.
But while the age of the warrior may have passed, deep sentiment for the samurai heritage still lingered in the hearts of many Japanese citizens. In 1898, a scant 2 decades following the rebellion in Satsuma, private citizens erected a statue of Saigo Takamori in a park in Tokyo. At the behest of nervous government officials, the likeness reflects the more peaceful side of the warrior chieftain, still remembered as the last true samurai. In the closing decades of the 19th century, the new Meiji imperial government in Japan scrambled to industrialize and build a formidable modern war machine. The growth of the country's naval and military sciences had been stunted by 2.5 centuries of self-imposed isolation, and Japan's leaders were determined to catch up with Western nations.
The knowledge was there when Japan was supposedly closed. Enough people knew what to borrow, what to get, what they needed to make Japan much stronger. And I think the speed at which they were able to do that is just really remarkable.
By the early 20th century, Japan was a force to be reckoned with. While the samurai no longer existed as a recognized social class, the compulsory public education system inculcated many of their beliefs and customs, especially the warrior code, into young students. The schools also resurrected the notions of the emperor's divinity and the superiority of the Japanese race. These ideas eventually helped fuel Japan's naked aggression during World War II, a conflict in which the legacy of the samurai blatantly reared its head.
The Japanese Imperial Army seized on the samurai, not surprisingly, as a major symbol for forging a kind of code or a culture for its officers and men.
However, such exploitation of the warrior code flew in the face of its original intent. The modern Japanese military was made up largely of farmer and merchant stock, and the warrior code had traditionally been a means of defining how samurai were different from these classes of society.
The Imperial Army turned that around and said, no, these are warrior values. That means they're Japanese values, and we're all samurai at heart.
During the fighting in the Pacific, the warrior code's emphasis on self-sacrifice revealed itself in the Japanese soldiers' seeming lack of regard for their own lives. Believing it was better to die than to surrender, Imperial Army soldiers in several extended battles, including Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, engaged in suicidal charges when it became obvious that a fight was lost.